Well, it's a very great pleasure now to introduce Dr Allan Chapman from Oxford University. He did his first degree at the University of Lancaster and then postgraduate work at Wadham College, Oxford. He's an historian of science with particular interests in scientific biography and in the history of astronomy, but indeed many areas of the history of science, and also with an interest in this science-religion dialogue too, and the historical aspects of that particularly. He teaches in the Faculty of Modern History in Oxford, has researched widely and published, and also lectures very widely indeed, getting many invitations to do so. And in 1994 he gave the Royal Society's triennial Wilkins Lecture in the history of science on the famous astronomer Edmund Halley. So, and has also been visiting professor at Gresham College. So we're delighted to have you with us, Alan, and look forward to your talk on medieval cosmology in the church.
And anyway, I'm here today to talk about cosmology, and I'll take my jacket off too actually, about cosmology in medieval Europe, and to look at a period when very often we get the popular impression, and certainly this persists in much of the popular literature, that you have the golden age of the ancient world, you have the Greeks, the philosophers, you then have perhaps late classical antiquity, and then you have the long dark sleep. Europe shut shop for 1,000 years. European intellectual life is dominated by men in black cloaks with tridents and red-hot irons, and if you dare so much whisper an original idea, they have you locked up, tortured and burned. And then suddenly comes the Renaissance, where everything is put right again. And you have a combination of Martin Luther, Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo. And then we're all ready to get into the modern world. Tragedy, this still is a common persistent. Not within the learned world now. It's true that most of the 20th century, and certainly from the 1920s and 30s onwards, professional scholars have been systematically unpicking that idea. Certainly unpicking the idea of the church as a persecuting organisation in the Middle Ages. But amazingly still in 2009, it's alive and kicking in popular literature, popular assumption, and the automatic use of phrases like the Dark Ages for anything that happens effectively before the time of the Renaissance. Now, I am myself very, very interested in this period, and particularly its scientific and religious relationships, because what is very obvious is that there was an intense amount of scientific philosophical activity takes place in this period, especially between approximately 1050 AD and about 1450, 1500. This doesn't mean that you're suddenly waking up out of a deep sleep in 1050. No, but for various factors, including perhaps a climatic warm in northern Europe, perhaps a diminution of certain diseases such as leprosy, an increase in population. Definitely if you're having a climatic warm, more land can be put under the plough, there can be bigger harvests, and hence a better fed population. We really don't know. But we certainly know that by about 1000 AD, it was warmer in Europe than it had been a bit earlier, and the population increases, and all manner of activity increase around it. Economic activity, the growth of towns, corporate activity, new monastic movements such as the Cistercians, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and so on. The universities of medieval Europe, and of course coming in here from the station, every lamppost has a great banner on it. Cambridge University's 800th year, 1209 to 2009, and of course Cambridge is one of the universities of this period. Oxford, the Sorbonne, Bologna, Montpellier, Salamanca, and so on. These new extraordinary universities, these sort of engines of intellectual life in Europe, all of which were broadly given the title Studium Generale, In other words, places where the whole of learning could be studied, with international communities under the Latin language. I'm going to be coming to that in a few minutes. But I think it's very important to bear in mind that there was this extraordinary energy in medieval Europe. It was, of course, very much connected to the church, but the church spearheads it. The church provides it the best brains in Europe. And to put it bluntly, you have to search jolly hard to find the normal number of ritualized burnings, whippings, imprisonings, and all the rest of it, a popular legend, as I will be coming on to later in the talk. But where does this tradition come from? I think, obviously, of course, that the Greek world provides a number of crucial features. It's fascinating how the Greek world has within it this idea of there being a one God, discussed by certain of the Greek philosophers, broadly called the Logos, or the Nous, or the creator, or the mover, or the starter, who was said to be bigger and greater and more powerful, maybe not personalized like God the Father or the God of Abraham, but somehow a greater force. A being whose name itself, Logos, or one of the names Logos, provides us the origin of the word like logic. And I think one of the greatest ever, what you might call barriers or things crossed by the human mind, was the Greek realization that mathematics was unfalsifiable. The idea that in all of the stress and strain and movement and mess of this world, certain things never changed. You could not falsify the theorem of Pythagoras. You could not falsify that 2 and 2 are 4. And the very concept of a mathematical or a geometrical proof comes from the Greeks of circa the 6th century BC. This also suggests, why is there this truth lying in nature? And of course, this is what gives rise to the idea of the Logos. If there is an absolute, unfalsifiable truth, is there an absolute and unfalsifiable means behind that truth? The Greeks are rather vague and woolly on it in places, but I think it introduces a powerful concept. I had suggested in the 2nd century BC, and especially in places like Alexandria, Tarsus, Asia Minor, and so on, where you have that spread of Jewish communities around the Eastern Mediterranean, outside the Holy Land, the Jews of the diaspora, when this community also, with of course its one Abrahamic father God, encounters this Greek world of an intellectual Logos, I think you have a fascinating dynamic taking place. Because clearly one is a bit like the other. One is personalized, yes, the Jewish God is personalized, the Greek Logos isn't. But they are both absolute, they are both unfalsifiable, and they're seen, if not quite as in the case of the Logos, creator gods, at least eternal truth gods. That, I think, is a very, very powerful thing. And it goes, of course, completely against the idea of the earlier Greek ideas of polytheism and so on. So I think in the Greek world, you often have in the intellectual communities this sort of double religious standard. You have all the rapscallion pack that live on Mount Olympus and get up to all sorts of silly tricks. Then you have something bigger and grander and mathematical. And if you can also have something powerful in mathematics, what about other things such as logic, precise intellectual processes for the unveiling of truth, and also the very idea of scholarship and critical thinking, this very, very powerful Greek legacy. I think when these two go together, and of course the Christian faith itself is, in my view, incarnated in approximately, 0 AD, it brings into this very, very powerful current the idea which was to have a profound effect on the future 2,000 years. Now, this, I think, is what happens in the late ancient world. Why then does this supposedly die out, or the rich intellectual traditions around it die out? We have to realize that when you start to look within this tradition in the late ancient world, mathematical ideas are remarkably widespread. There are, for instance, two sources which were immensely influential in the late ancient world, were rediscovered in the 11th century in Western Europe, and which bring this over. One is Vitruvius. Vitruvius's books on architecture. Architectura in libere decem. Architecture in 10 books, 10 studies. We think just about before the time of Christ, 1015 BC, something like that. Vitruvius was not the greatest architect of the Roman world. He was a member of a profession. The key thing is, what he wrote about architecture survived. And not only his works on architecture and the mathematics of form and things of this sort, but you look at Architectura in libere decem, the most accessible form would be the Loeb Classics edition, and you start off with the discussion of cosmology. Before you start talking about how to put stones on stones, it's about proportion in the cosmos, and how the architect should capture the unity of creation. He starts off by describing the observations made 2 centuries before by the Greek mathematician Eratosthenes, who actually succeeded in measuring the size of the Earth in accordance with mathematical criteria, using shadows and scales and parts of a circle. And if you translate Eratosthenes' values, Greek stadia, into English miles, you get about 8,000 miles diameter of the Earth. So that's one very influential work. The other one too is Pliny. Pliny's natural history, Histoire naturelle, about 80 AD, Pliny the Younger, edits his uncle's work. Uncle, of course, the great Roman philosopher, had been killed in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. Now this book itself is the great, immensely influential treatise on medieval natural science. It deals with biology, it deals with the heavens, it deals with where the sources of the winds are, why, for instance, you have the Sirocco coming off the Sahara in summer and things of this sort, trying to get to a basis of what are the causes of the winds, what are the causes of the tides and so on. And again, he starts them all rolling by the cosmos. How do we know how big the world is? Where is everything? And he also repeats Eratosthenes' ideas about measuring the size of the Earth by geometry. It gives you some idea of 2 things here. Not only how profoundly, deeply sunk into the Roman mind was the idea of a spherical Earth, but also of a Greek's attempt of 3 centuries before to measure the size of that Earth in astonishingly good terms. And not just measure it, give it you in a form that anybody could measure it. Here's what I did. These were the times of the year where I did it. These were the locations in which my measurements. If you think I'm talking a load of nonsense, go out there and try it yourself. This, of course, is what we recognize as a process of falsification in science. Now, these writers form major components of the medieval curriculum. They get pirated. They get bits abstracted out of them. They occur in all sorts of weird and wonderful forms. The famous bestiaries, the books of beasts of medieval Europe. The lapidaria, the books on the strange and diverse forms of stones in the Middle Ages. And all kinds of books dealing with weather and so on, which the early medievals, 9th, 10th century, composed for their own usage, very often are rifled from Pliny and his writings. Now we have to bear in mind, in a manuscript culture, as you have in the Roman world and you have in the medieval world, our idea of a complete book was often not that important. Far more important were to take the sections of it relevant to your interest and abstract them. And I can give you this as a rather curious and very, very brought to my attention personal example from last November. I was giving a lecture at Leeds University, and friends of mine there in the classics faculty actually wanted me to have a look at a Greek Ptolemy. A Greek Ptolemy in 3 volumes, 14th century Byzantine, circa 1360, something like that. And these 3 beautiful little volumes acquired in the 19th century and put into Victorian binding. They were not the whole of Ptolemy's Almagest. There were segments and sections of it. It was thought taken from a Byzantine monastery. They had taken the bits about planetary calculation and the calendar that interested them, written in a beautiful Greek scribal hand, but the rest of it wasn't there. Medieval scholars took from the classical encyclopedias what they wanted. Just like a student today might photocopy several pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica for a particular purpose with which they're dealing. After all, writing Ptolemy's Almagest from start to finish was a big job. Certainly, history of the Plinian history, start to finish, was a whopping job. But if you were interested in the behaviour of badgers or the source of winds in northern Italy, then you take the bits that interested you. And this is why you often have fragments across monastic collections across Europe. Now this is the tradition which becomes very, very powerful. And you have to bear in mind so much late classical scientific knowledge is essentially encyclopedic. It's bringing together traditions and bits that might interest a diversity of people. And of course here, Boethius, often referred to in his sanctified form of Saint Severinus, the name of which was buried in, I think it's Pavia Cathedral in Italy, was another of these great compilers of philosophical digests. And Boethius, Boete, rundles through the Middle Ages in his various abstractions on mathematics, on philosophy. He never completed it, because sadly he was executed by a king whose courtier he crossed before he was able to bring the work together. But these are the sources that feed in to medieval Europe. Now, when you start to look at who's doing what in early medieval Europe, I'm speaking here very early, 700, 800, 900 AD, you start to find that there's the beginning of a remarkably integrated Latin culture borrowed from Greek models. A lot of the internal stuff is Greek in its roots, but also too, it's Latin in its expression. A man whom I have described as Great Britain's first known dated astronomer, the Venerable Bede of the Abbey of Jarrow. Born in 675, dies in 735, 60, good age for that time. We know he was involved in mathematical computation. We know he was master of the novices in his monastery. He had the duty of teaching the young monks to calculate and do mathematics, and a number of his fragments, so in fact more than his fragments, survive. His little treatise De Temporibus on time involves calendar calculation and things of this sort. The one thing immediately hits you when you look at Bede's writings on astronomy and mathematics: the Earth is assumed to be round. The Earth is at the centre of the universe. The planets rotate around it. You then have a sphere of the fixed stars. This essentially is Ptolemy's cosmology. And this is in a monastery 400 miles right up the English coast in Jarrow, near Newcastle on Tyne. We also know that great monasteries like St. Gallen, there were mathematical calculators. A little bit later, a Frenchman, Gerbert of Aurillac, who becomes Pope Sylvester II, the Millennium Pope. Gerbert, or St. Sylvester II, is Pope in the millennial year of 1000. Before he became Pope, though, he'd had a marvellous reputation as a mathematician, a calculator, a deviser of machines, and a teacher of the astrolabe, a device invented by Ptolemy, which he probably acquired through Arabic roots in Spain, had European versions with Latin texts made on them, and teaching for doing the basic stuff of when is the date of Easter, when do the movable feasts of the church take place, and of course if you're on somewhere like Jarrow, when is it going to be high tide and low tide, and when does the moon govern all of these things. This is good, solid, classical astronomy. There's no hocus pocus involved. There's nothing to do with witches or ghosts or anything like that. Bede is a good, solid, scholarly calculator by the standards of his day. He's also a devout monk, probably in the Benedictine tradition, but we don't quite know what the order was at that time in Jarrow. So you have a monk, mathematician, philosopher, a Christian scientist, I suppose you could call him. Gerbert of Aurillac is also a Benedictine, born somewhere in the region of about 930 AD, becomes Pope in his late 60s. And you find more and more of these people the more you look at them. And so therefore the Dark Ages get lighter the more you see in them, the more coherent material from the ancient world comes forward, and what is very important, the church finds it far from being threatening, it finds it useful, and hence is useful for calendars, calculations, education, and teaching young men in the monasteries about the greatness and the beauty of God's creation, the logic of mathematics. Now this is there by certainly 1000 AD, by an established tradition in the West. I think also, to look at cosmology and to look at the theories they had of the universe, one also has to look at the social structures which are emerging at this time. Because medieval Europe, certainly from about 1000 AD onwards, starts to develop a series of internal organizations which I think are crucial for where we are today. One of them is the very place where you are now sitting. The concept of a studium generale, a university, a place where you came to study. I think one of the central things which they borrow out of the Greco-Roman world was what you might call civic virtue. The idea that there was something bigger than your family, your tribe, your local district. There was something which anybody who was willing to, what you might call, buy into the ideal could belong to. The town council, the monastic chapter, the cathedral, the commercial organisation. You find this with a burgeoning across Europe of self-electing monastic chapters, with cathedral chapters themselves, where deans and canons often played major roles in deciding who they had. And frankly, there is a classical route. You look in the Acts of the Apostles, when Judas goes off and hangs himself or does whatever he does to himself, and there's a gap in the 12, what do the 12 do? They hold an election, and they elect Matthias. A very Greek process, running at that time in first century Palestine, absorbing that culture. I think what these things do bring commerce into the equation too. When you look at the forming of either the great town councils of Europe, Venice, Nuremberg, Augsburg, Florence, London, the city of London, a great merchant trading centre from certainly the late 11th century. Who are on these things? These are personal authority exclusion zones. No king, no pope, no bishop, no monarch was normally allowed to fish in these things. Slap you on the hand and keep out if you try. After all, even today, Her Majesty the Queen cannot enter the square mile of the city of London without the consent of the mayor and corporation. And of course, this was very, very visible only a few years ago at the Queen's 50th anniversary, and when, of course, a cortege was coming through to go to St. Paul's for a great celebratory service, it was stopped on Cheapside as she was coming into the city and ritualistically asked, "What are you doing here?" Because everybody knew, but showing that ancient privilege. Now, my suggestion is the important thing of that privilege is it recognises independent authority. And that here becomes crucial. It becomes crucial with colleges that form fellowships. What, of course, is the Latin title of a fellowship in Oxford or Cambridge? Associate, a society. A fellow is associus in Latin, an electing member of a body. In many cases, electing their own head or warden or provost or principal or whatever else it was called. Merchant corporations, like the Hamburg-based Hanseatic League. German merchants clubbing together to build ships in early joint stock companies, to trade with Scandinavia for tar and for fur, to sell it in Spain for wine and oriental produce, and literally the beginnings of business organisation. Augsburg, Florence and Nuremberg are major pioneering banking centres. The whole concept of credit banking is medieval. Governed by families that sometimes get too big for their boots, like the Medici. Yes, sometimes they turn themselves into great so-called bogus nobility. But the Medici started flogging sheep's wools on the Tuscan hills, made their money, assumed aristocracy, and so on. But that very idea that you could have a sort of do-it-yourself ladder into aristocracy, if you got rich enough, that itself is a very interesting feature. I have described medieval Nuremberg as the Silicon Valley of the Middle Ages, because certainly by 1400, in Nuremberg, you could commission a clock to be built, a fine suit of armour, an early gun, have a book printed, buy a loan at a certain fixed rate of interest that you could draw on Paris, In other words, the leading technological resources of the age were focused on places like Nuremberg, Augsburg, then later Paris, London, and so on. Why I say so much about this corporate structure is because I think it was crucial to forming much bigger, more flexible, more intellectually and spiritually responsive institutions in Europe we are probably given credit for. These organizations were not there as some kind of things dictated to by autocratic people. They were, after all, there that were self-governing, and they give a whole colouring to what is happening in Western Europe. Another key thing too, which I think is borrowed from the ancient Greek world, and certainly the Roman world, and this is the fact of a sort of dualism of power. After all, look at the papal and political doctrines of the Middle Ages. You have the popes, indicated of course by the keys of St. Peter, and you also had the sword of the emperors and the popes. One had access to the gates of heaven, the other was supposed to protect the world from civil unrest. Very often, of course, as human beings, they fell out. Like dogs and cats, they fell out. The wars between the emperors and the popes were one of the most bloody cycles of the Middle Ages. But the very idea that there was a presumed divine model for a secular authority and a spiritual authority, and no matter how much it may fail in reality, it was the aspiration. And I think this idea of dual authority runs right through to our own time. It's why, for instance, in medieval churches and in medieval colleges and cathedral chapters, there was always a recognition of the secularium. In other words, those skills which were just practical and useful, financial and things of this sort. The banker was essential to the bishop, in the same way that the sword was essential to the pope. Now that, I think, forms a very powerful trade-off. It makes medieval European society vastly more complex, more subtle, and more capable of intellectual response than the popular assumption. Now it's in this world, therefore, I would suggest that you have to look for the relationship of science and Christianity in medieval times, and why I think you have a lot to look for. Start first of all with the universities. Europe's first university is probably either Bologna or Paris. It depends on what you mean. Is it the first university that continues and never breaks its tradition, in which case it would be the Sorbonne, probably about 1120 AD, or would it be the first institution to be founded, go defunct, and be recreated? Bologna, about 900, 1000 AD. Either way, the idea was you had a place where a young body of men could go to receive instruction, where the people giving the instruction prided themselves in their freedom. And what of course happens in Paris when the Archbishop of Paris tries to come down on the student community, they pull off from the Ile-de-France and move to the left bank, where they actually have protection from a local prince who doesn't like the Archbishop. So in other words, you actually find secular authority for your university, although all the men in that university, the tutors, would either be priests or intended to be priests. That fascinating dualism. Oxford itself, traditionally of course under the rule of the Bishop of Lincoln. Now fortunately Lincoln's 200 miles away from Oxford. You can get rid of all sorts of monkey tricks if the bishop's so far away. This again gives rise to all kinds of tensions that are there. But also let's not remember too, don't forget too, the bishops, the archbishops, had themselves been through this process as students when they were young men. So yes, they may have grown up to great authority in middle age and old age, but they, I'm sure, would have remembered what it was like to be a cheeky young urchin in the streets of Paris or in the streets of Oxford, pulling faces at the clergy when they were 17. Now this, I think, is a healthy dynamic. This has nothing directly to do with the intellectual structure in itself, no, but it's a social fabric out of which an intellectual structure begins to emerge. What did they teach in these medieval universities? Well, broadly speaking, you had a sort of sevenfold division of the curriculum. This was drawn from a number of Latin and Greek writers, from people like Donatus, a grammar teacher in the late Roman world, borrowed from Plato, borrowed from Thales and Pythagoras and the classical mathematicians, largely drawn from the writings of Ptolemy. Very importantly from my point of view and the science point of view is what they call the quadrivium, the four. These were four disciplines of a mathematical character, and they were these: astronomy, geometry, music, and arithmetic. Astronomy, geometry, music, and arithmetic. Astronomy, of course, was the cosmology of the day, the central earth of Ptolemy, the spheres rotating around it, the angels on the spheres, as derived from people like the pseudo-Dionysius in the 5th century. Geometry, of course, was the geometry of Euclid, in its perhaps slightly simplified, boiled-down form that they would have derived in sort of the Latin Euclids, often heavily edited with only the bits in that interested individual people. But Euclidus was very, very familiar in the universities of Europe. Pythagoras was a well-known figure. You sometimes come across pictures in medieval manuscript with a bearded man with a pair of compasses and a drawing board, and Pythagoras is written above him. We've no idea what Pythagoras really looked like, but nonetheless, Pythagoras, the epitome of the Greek philosopher-mathematician. Geometry is that. Arithmetic is about the truth of numbers. What fascinated the medieval mind is that numbers had an eternal spiritual power, irrespective of what the numbers represented. Whether 2 and 2 cows made 4 cows or whatever, what mattered was the fact that numbers never lied. That must mean that mathematics, geometry, logic, and the logos were somehow in the mind of God, somehow there from the creation and moving through the world. And human beings possessing intellect could access these, because we in the image of God could access these ideas. That is one of their ideas that run through, and why somehow we develop a link with God through intellect. Not a Gnostic idea, no, it's not an irreverent Gnostic idea, but if God has given us intellect, then we can use the sacred power of mathematics as a way of getting ideas of truth in the world. Then music. Music, of course, was written on extensively by the Burgundians, the court in Burgundy, and especially, of course, the University of Chartres and the cathedral community at Chartres. What was their music? We are not talking here of performance art. This wasn't how to play your pipe or your lute or your sackbut or something like that. It was the geometry of the heavens. Now, when you bear in mind the diatonic scale, which is being used musically in Europe by the 12th century, as it were C to C on the way up, corresponded to the number of spheres of classical astronomy. Da 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 da. The moon, the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the fixed stars. On the other hand, they thought that there were 9 spheres, but there was one sphere you couldn't see, because this was a sort of great gear wheel. They call it the primum mobile. They get all the others in check as it rotated. Each of the planets have a different period of rotation. They knew this from the ancient world. Saturn goes round in 29 years, Jupiter goes round in 12 years, Mars in 2, the Sun in 1, Venus in 277 days, Mercury in 88 days, the Moon in 27.5. They get slower the further out they go. Why is this? Is this because space is immensely large and they're all actually going at the same speed, but Saturn is having to cover far, far, far more ground than the Moon is having to cover? Or is it because they're perhaps a bit closer and are actually travelling slower? Could it be therefore that if you predicted or you plotted the speeds against the planets, you would get a scale that looked like a scale of music? And when you try this, it actually works. They didn't know the exact distances that we do in the modern sense, but they had a good proportionate rough guess as to the distances of the cosmos. They thought the universe was much smaller, but the basic mathematics they got right. And they saw something wonderful in the idea that there was this logic in music, and that the music mirrored astronomy. Also too, the psychology of sound was seen as bringing physics, astronomy and God together. Why were there pleasant and unpleasant sounds? Why, for instance, if you took what you thought was the perfect organization of the planet, did you get a pleasant sequence, da 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 da? Yet if you change them a bit, you'd have got discords, da 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 that would have been rough on the ear. Could it be therefore that what we call beautiful and the sound sequences that we call beautiful were there because God put those proportions in our minds? Cosmology, divinity and music run together. That's why they taught music in the universities, and it's that the music they taught. Now I would argue that everybody who'd been through a university from Salamanca to Prague in the medieval period would have encountered this. We know the young Isaac Newton encountered it at Grantham Grammar School in the middle of the 17th century. And he probably would have imbibed it in at least a slightly antique form when he came up to Trinity in 1661 here in Cambridge. It was a massively influential tradition. Also too, there were a number of textbooks that were standard for it. One of the most enduringly popular science books ever written. It even beats Patrick Moore's numerous books in terms of best-selling popularity, and that is Johannes de Sacro Bosco, John of the Holy Wood, De Sphera Mundi, the sphere of the world, circa 1240. Don't have an exact date for its composition. Who exactly was Sacro Bosco, John of the Holy Wood? Well, some say he was an Irishman, some say he came from Halifax in Yorkshire. Frankly, we have absolutely no idea. All we can say he was a North European. And he did not write an original work. De Sphera Mundi was a sort of textbook aimed at undergraduates in fairly simple Latin with crude drawings and in the later printed editions, crude woodcuts. I've traced from the Bodleian Library catalogue in Oxford the last printing of these works, these medieval works by Johannes de Sacro Bosco, go well into the 17th century. And Newton himself did Sacro Bosco in Grantham Grammar School, which gives you some idea of the intense power of this tradition. So you actually have astronomical bestsellers. Yes, it's geocentric astronomy. Everything is rotating around the Earth. There's a fixed sphere of the stars out there. But the key thing is, there must have been countless millions of men across medieval Europe who were astronomically literate in the broadest sense, who also even too connected the literacy of astronomy with the literacy of music theory and things of this kind. And the popular idea of a persecution of scientific interests simply will become as laughably silly at the fact that the church, the universities and the great monasteries taught this stuff relentlessly for centuries. It's true probably with not a lot of modification. After all, if it was an absolute truth, why do you need to keep modifying it? But even so, the idea of young men knowing their astronomy, and by the time at the age of 60 you end up in an episcopal throne with a mitre on your head, you still know something about astronomy. Now, one thing too, to give us some indication about how tenacious and widespread this astronomical teaching tradition was, comes out of Geoffrey Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer, who of course his Canterbury Tales are perhaps one of the most important single medieval works that people encounter for the first time. And we encounter many of these wonderful stories, many of them bawdy tales and so on. Yet, we often forget what Chaucer's own knowledge was. Chaucer actually was a poet by a hobby. He had a day job. He was the surveyor of the royal buildings to King Edward III, a professional architect and civil engineer, as well as bouts as a tax collector, a senior civil servant, and things like that. He was a man professionally deeply involved in practical, down-to-earth affairs. And his poems are written as sort of, in many ways, interludes and expressions at the court, perhaps even for entertainment. But this idea of a fascination with science comes in a lot of the tales. And I'm often aghast at medieval English scholars who, when I ask them about things of Chaucer, let's say the prologue to the Physician's Tale or things of this sort, will say, oh, I never read that, I can't understand that. You know, you have so much scientific knowledge in Chaucer. The prologue to the Physician's Tale is a complete treatise on Galenic medicine and what doctors did in circa 1380. Not hocus pocus, good, solid, classical stuff taken from Greeks. You then read too the Canon's Yeoman's Tale, the tale of a pair of rapscallion, bogus alchemists. You have a detailed account of how alchemical procedures were pursued, the apparatus employed, the texts they depended on, and things like that. Again, a lot of people say, oh, I don't read that, it's not poetic enough for me. And then the one that everybody reads is the absolute most favourite, which, of course, is the Miller's Tale. Miller's Tale, perhaps the most bawdy of all the stories. You may say, what's scientific about that? Well, the star rapscallion in that story is Master Nicholas, or Master Nicolai. And he is an Oxford student, and he's out to try to seduce his landlord's pretty young wife. And we're told a lot about him, and of course he was probably intended to become a priest anyway, but that's not actually mentioned, but it would be implied. We're told, though, what he had in his room. He had a copy of Ptolemy, his Almagestium. This rapscallion young pipsqueak has a copy of Ptolemy's Almagest. Probably not the complete Almagest. I suspect it was Miss Sacrobosco's condensed version, De Sphaera Mundi. He also possessed an astrolabian, an astrolabe, a complex mathematical instrument, deriving from Ptolemy, coming from Arabic prototypes, used in the West. A rapscallion student has one of these things. It makes you ask the bigger question. If Chaucer is mentioning these in the tales, it would assume it's very familiar knowledge. It would be like somebody saying today, and young Bill, the young pipsqueak scapegrace of St John's, Cambridge, happens to have an Apple Mac such and such and such a model. It would assume that the hearers would know what the device was. I would suggest the mentioning of Ptolemy, mathematical instruments, chemical devices, medical procedures in Chaucer themselves indicate a scientifically literate hearership. And Chaucer's hearership would not have been monks and priests. There would have been courtiers, lawyers, medics, civil servants, people like that, what you might call a literate upper middle class of 14th century England. Chaucer's stories too were the first secular publications printed in Britain after the Bible and the Prayer Book. And in fact, again, the market to devour these tales, assuming a knowledge of this scientific basis which utterly underpins Chaucer. So I think that's another key thing to bring in mind, the way in which Chaucer's ideas penetrate that world, and assume that the cosmology of medieval times was, at least the conventional cosmology, would have been on every fairly educated person's lips. But then what about original researches? What about things where medieval people really did start pushing the barriers? Because everything I've said so far was essentially a Greek or a Latin derivation, a modification from an earlier prototype. Here we encounter optics, the study of light. This, I would suggest, is the first area of main, fundamental, original physics research. Where does it begin? Well, let's see what they get from the ancient world. Ptolemy, in his Dioptrica, mentions a number of things. He mentions polished quartz balls, which gave distortions and colours and things like that. And then too, he talks about those things such as rainbows, mock suns, or sundogs as they're sometimes called, strange reflections of the light, and gives a series of theories for them. What he suggests, you always have the colours in particular orders. But what is light? Well, Ptolemy, maybe either originally or, as I suspect, drawing on a well-accepted tradition of optics in the Greek world, suggests that light is pure. Light comes from the heavens. It is an emanation of God, whether you see that as a monotheistic or you see that as a Greek polytheistic god, either way, it's a celestial power coming in. And hence it's pure. But when it somehow encounters earthly things, it gets corrupted. And hence it degenerates into the famous 6 or 7, depending on the quality of your eyesight, colours of the rainbow. And of course it doesn't just happen with rainbows, but rays of sunlight going through quartz blocks, anything like that gives you the colours. Always predictable colours. So this is basically optical theory, theories of refraction, reflection, taken from people such as Ptolemy. The first people to do serious work on optics in medieval times were in the Arab world. And undoubtedly the most original and profoundly influential of these is, in the Arabic, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Ibn Haytham, or as he was always known in medieval Europe, Al-Hazan. Now he is working at around 1000 AD in Cairo. He's a doctor. He works in Cairo, we assume, earning his living as a medic. But he becomes fascinated by light, by colours, and by reflections. And to some degree, there are some advantages about doing this in Cairo. You have brilliant, brilliant light out there. You don't get many rainbows in somewhere like Cairo, because this is one of the problems he had, trying to replicate stuff with rainbows. But he's probably one of the first people to write up the camera obscura. On a warm day, shut up your windows, bore a hole through the shutters, and you see the outside world on this wall, upside down and right to left, moving images, whatever is happening. He tries to work out a theory how that happens, and develops a sort of rudimentary theory of diffraction and refraction, light being bent to produce images. Then also too, another question: why does the sky start to get light for a good time before the sun comes above the horizon? And moreover, why does it stay light after the sun has physically set? Now it's true that the twilight, they call it in the Latin tradition, de crepulis, is longer in the north than it is in 30 degrees north, which is Cairo, but it's still there in Cairo. What does it? Al-Hazan did some ingenious experiments in probably the 980s, something like that. Using an astrolabe, which is a brass disc, usually about the size of a dinner plate, with a scale around the outside and a series of planetary scales on the inside, and with sight holes, he claims that when looking before dawn, he saw little clouds in the sky with just tinged with sunlight. He would measure them. And of course he didn't have a clock, but then he would measure positions of stars as they were setting, brighter stars as they were setting, and then try to get the period of how long it is before the sun appears on the eastern horizon. And you're doing it like the ancient Egyptians would have done, from constellations going from being visible to just about vanishing over the horizon. And he calculates that you start to get the beginning and the ending of twilight when the sun is 19 degrees below the horizon, either at morning or evening, suggesting that the atmosphere acts as a lens and bends the light. Now, he knows the atmosphere is transparent, and Al-Hazan sees an analogy between that and a lump of polished quartz, which is a brilliant conceptual idea. He talks about the images produced by polished quartz and by water and things of this sort. He wants to really say more about rainbows, but of course you don't get many rainbows in Egypt. And he writes his works up, and they come to be available. They're rapidly translated into Latin, and they're known in the West as the Optical Thesaurus of Al-Hazan. The Optical Thesaurus. It's a pretty substantial work. Now, this was translated into Latin, probably somewhere in the early 1100s, beginning of the 12th century, and becomes very influential. It forms a sort of stepping stone to another set of researches in Western Europe. A number of people work on this. Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, is fascinated by light, himself an Oxford graduate. And then a man whom he influences greatly, Roger Bacon, popularly nicknamed Friar Bacon of Oxford. Friar Bacon, working perhaps in Oxford, perhaps in Paris, perhaps in a number of places, we know he lived and worked in a number of places in Northern Europe, does a series of experiments with light. We think Bacon is born about 1210. He seems to have died in 1294, an incredible age for that time, 84, something like 84. And one of the key things he does, and believe me, Oxford's a very convenient place to do this because Oxford's very, very wet, is to start measuring rainbows. He starts to find, and here he's partly guided by Ptolemy, who has written at this stage the state of the art of rainbows, and he deduces the fact that a rainbow is a cone. The bow is the base of, or the sectional base of a cone. The sun must always be at the apex of that cone. The geometrical axis through the cone goes to the centre of the cone, and you, the observer, have to be standing on that axis to see the bow. So there's the sun, you are there, there's the bow. The best bows are at night and morning, when the sun is on the horizon and you get big bows. Bacon was able to explain the thing which had puzzled many philosophers before. Why do you never see rainbows at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in summer? The sun is too high. If that's the axis you need for a rainbow, the best ones are evening and morning. At midday, they're like that. The bows are down here, you can't see them. Hence, of course, the rainbow is a sort of optical system. And what seems to lie at the heart of it are clouds. He then does something which I have been so bold enough to call the first discovery in optical physics in Western Europe. Using an astrolabe, he takes measurements of the heights of the bow, heights of the cloud, heights of the sun, his own position, and as far as we can tell, tries to reconstruct geometrically this shape on Earth. He finds that the light going into the bow always comes out to the observer at 42 degrees. It doesn't change. It's always 42 degrees. He doesn't know why, and he has various theories about reflection and compound reflection, but he's got the fact. He writes this up, and then it's taken up in Germany by Theodoric, or sometimes called Dietrich of Freiburg. And Theodoric, or Dietrich, the same man, takes it next stage further in about 1320. And he does something which Bacon had tried, but now Theodoric does it even more so. And I think this is crucial to scientific thinking. The idea that you model external phenomenon in the laboratory. What Dietrich does, he tells us he takes glass spheres and quartz spheres and admits thin chinks of light to them. And he measures in the dark where the spectrum is coming out from where it went in. Now, Bacon had done similar things to this as well. He notices that you always get with an artificial rainbow exactly the same order of colours as you get to a natural rainbow. And the angle is the same. And Theodoric seemed to become a pioneer of what later physicists would call, people like Descartes, would call ray tracing, and tries to work out the shape of the bouncing and refracting and reflectings within the sphere. So that, in other words, if you have a sort of sphere, and think of each sphere as every single raindrop, the millions and millions of raindrops in a cloud, the light will come into the bottom, be bent slightly up, reflected at about 90 degrees from the inner surface of the drop, which of course acts like a mirror, hits the top one, comes out again, and then exits. So in other words, you have in, up, out. And the out is 42 degrees to the in. Various medieval philosophers and experimentalists tried to reconstruct exactly the internal ray tracing. But they've now gone beyond it being a cloud, and now gone towards it being millions of individual droplets that form a cloud. There being no such thing as a rainbow, there only being millions and millions of individual ray tracings coming out. And if you are stood in the right position vis-a-vis the sun and the general direction of the rays, then you see a bow. That isn't bad. And that's been put into a fairly good shape by circa 1350. Same time too, Bacon, allegedly, but certainly somebody in Italy by the end of Bacon's life, has hit upon the idea that if you take lenticels of quartz and figure them, you will of course get magnifying glasses. It's said that two Italians by the name of Spina or della Spina and Amati take it next further and have the bright idea that if you have the two pieces of polished quartz and put them before your eyes, you can correct defective vision. Spectacles are certainly there by 1450. They're appearing in Western art by 1370. And you often get them at first on the pictures of great, learned, long-dead theologians. There are two people who are often shown having a pair of specs in medieval iconography. One, of course, is St. Augustine, the greatest philosopher, the Doctor Mirabilis of the medieval church, learned man. So if you're doing a picture of Augustine in, let's say, 1460, well, you've got to show him like a modern learned one with a pair of specs. The other one, of course, being St. Jerome, the producer of the Vulgate Bible, the Biblia Vulgata in the 14th century. And you can almost trace a history of spectacles from what you see of pictures of these saints. Sometimes they're leather spectacles, where the frames are cut out of leather, sandwiching the lens, stitched around the edges, and held on with bits of string around the ears. I was sent a few weeks ago from a friend of mine in Germany a modern computer scan of a postcard that she had acquired by somebody, and it was from one of the great German libraries. And he showed a schoolmaster. And there he is sat, and the picture is in about 1460. He's shown that on his high bench, his beretta, his birching rod to keep the little infant in place, and a big pair of leather specs on his eyes. Again, the image of the schoolmaster demands a picture of a pair of glasses by that date. So that if you're beginning to get a burgeoning optical industry, but this is coming with many layers. It's coming, what is light? What is the relationship of light to the celestial geometry of the heavens? Is light the pure emanation of God? Can man model the pure emanation of God on earth? And you have all manner of things going on in this. Light, I would suggest, lies at the basis of experimental physics. And it starts really from Alhazen, taken up in the West in the 13th century. But finally, I want to finish up by saying something about what they thought of the heavens themselves, the cosmos out there. Now, of course, we have the standard broad medieval image, drawn from the ancients. The Earth, about 8,000 miles in diameter, in the middle. According to Aristotle, made up of four elements. Earth at the bottom, water on the earth, air around the water, and fire around the air. So earth, air, fire, and water, constantly fighting with each other to produce wind and storm and stress and all the chaos that you get on the earth. Very, very nice to see in a Christian context, because now you see it as original sin itself is causing this mischievous, chaotic mixing. Then you have the planetary spheres, which I mentioned. Then you have, finally, the sphere of the heavens, the eighth sphere of the stars, and then the primum mobile, and what was often called the habitacle of the elect, heaven, God, and the blessed dead beyond. Hell in the middle of the earth. A nice, obvious juxtaposition. Hell should be its maximum distance from the earth, and maximum distance from heaven. Hell is therefore in the middle of the earth, and the heavens are up there. But you start to get a number of medieval figures who start to ask interesting questions. All of them are within the church. None of them get into trouble. Some of them, as I shall be mentioning, held very, very, very high office within the church. Start with William of Ockham, Balliol. I'm afraid that Cambridge was not the leading place here. A lot of this happened in Oxford, mainly at Merton and Balliol, but we'll forgive you for that, don't worry about that. William of Ockham. William of Ockham is a priest, a don, born somewhere around 1300, dies in the Great Plague of 1348, and starts to ask questions about how we know things. Can we know general categories of knowledge, such as the truth? Or can we only know individual manifestations of something, such as truthful acts, or something like that? Did God create general categories? In other words, did he create universals? Or did God create only particulars, or things that you could see, grasp, and understand? This starts an enormous amount of debate. Now, of course, central to the curriculum of medieval Europe by this time, and fully ingratiated by the 13th century, is the philosophy of Aristotle. Aristotle presumes general categories. But if you start doing analyses of how do we know things that we can't see, such as how do I know what's happening on the opposite side of the world? How do I know there's an opposite side of the world when nobody's actually been there? Then can Aristotelian categories carry over? You start to get an assault on Aristotle's ideas. And an assault which is not meant to be irreverent. After all, Aristotle was not a Christian. They often saw him as it were, posthumously Christianized, yes. But on the other hand, he is a pagan Greek philosopher. So you start to have this attack on how can we know what we know. Of course, they assume that naturally this is only within the normal intellectual human realm, because God, in his grace, can touch us whenever we ask him to do so. This is, after all, what Paul writes in the Romans. But on the other hand, in the realm of the pure intellect, how far can we go on our own? These are some of the things they're asking. And Occam is a priest. And then you get another body of figures, a contemporary of his, who dies in the same time, 1348, 1349, Thomas Bradwardine. Thomas Bradwardine is a man who starts to think about what is infinity. He touches, and a number of his more or less contemporaries within 100 years, start touching on a series of concepts which I would suggest don't resurface in Western thought until Einstein, Max Planck, and people like that. In other words, are there different states of being? How infinite could the universe be? The normal universe is thought to be bounded by the spheres. But if God is all-powerful and all-creative, and is infinitely possible, can you put bounds to God's creativity? Ergo, could the universe be infinite? It also leads on to a number of other suggestions, such as, what is the infinity of a geometrical point in Euclid? In Euclid, after all, at the beginning of his treatise, you get the idea that a point occupies no space. There is no space at all in a point. And this leads to debates about what is the size of nothing. Now, this is where you've got a number of the debates where people who don't understand medieval thinking use it as a way of showing how silly it was. How many angels can dance on the point of a pin? We're all familiar with that, one of these more popular, hoary old histories. That was not meant to be a piece of silliness. It was almost like a piece of relativity physics. Angels do not have extended bodies. Therefore, how many bodies that are not extended can be at one time on nothing? It's a bit like John Barrow. It's a bit like modern string theory. This is being talked of in the 14th century. When Bradwardine dies, he dies having just entered into office as Archbishop of Canterbury. He dies as one of the greatest philosopher archbishops of the Middle Ages. And by definition, he's hardly punished for his thinking if he dies on the throne of Canterbury. And then you have others. You have, on the continent, a number of key people. Jean Buridan, who becomes rector of the University of Paris, also takes up this infinity concern. What is infinity? Nicole de Oresme, who becomes a French bishop, and the one who draws his whole tradition together about 80 odd years later, in the 1420s, 1340s, Nicholas of Cusa, or Cus, K-U-E-S, depends whether you give it the Latin or the German spelling, a German cardinal, an early Renaissance cardinal, who writes about this new relativistic universe. Not only about how infinite could the universe be, but what is relative motion? If there is no absolute in space, what is going faster than something else? This is about 1430. And then he's asking as well about, is there a centre to the universe? Is it purely convention where we say the Earth is the centre of the universe and all the planets go around it? Could not God have made a universe with an infinity of locations, so there is no centre? Could not the stars, this is 2 centuries before Galileo and the telescope, could not the stars go on throughout space? Could we not simply be what you might call the victims of perspective? We're here, we see it all, we think that's all there is. This is relativity physics, 400, 500 years before Einstein. What is more, all of this is within the full debate of high-ranking clergy, bishops, archbishops, cardinals, within the universities of Europe, and not a single person is being threatened, bullied, or tortured for it. Now, somehow or other, this has got leached out of our understanding of medieval Europe. Also, too, Copernicus, who is born in 1470, and does his early work on the idea of the Earth moving around the Sun. Probably his first concept of that is about 1513, 30 years before the publication of his De Revolutionibus. He knew this tradition. He was, after all, a Polish scholar. This material was available within the learned Catholic world. He would have encountered it at Krakow. He would have encountered it certainly at Florence and Bologna, where he took degrees. And hence, of course, his idea of the sun perhaps being in the centre of the universe, the planets going around it, would not have sounded as daft as we popularly assume. Nor would it assume he would get into trouble for it. The reason why Copernicus didn't publish until 1543, more or less the time he died, was his fear of ridicule. But you have to bear in mind that he was more or less coaxed to bringing his great work through the press, not by atheists or by anything like that, but by 2 men who were professors at Wittenberg and were themselves successors of Luther. In other words, he was working with Protestants. And we know that Luther thought his ideas were silly. And of course, the famous comment, of course, about Copernicus by Luther, that fool who would set astronomy upon its head. What Copernicus feared was ridicule and abuse. Copernicus was a fairly shy, retiring man. He didn't like academic mudslinging. But frankly, when you look at what Luther called the Pope and various other people in the Roman Catholic Church, fool was almost approving. So we have a different perspective that comes in here. And when we bear in mind this tremendous takeoff in the 15th century of mathematics, another figure I just want to mention in finishing, very, very influential, is a Greek Orthodox. And this is Johannes Bessarion, native of Trebizond in Greece, who came over in 1531 to Europe, to Italy, to become a sort of attender at the university. I think it was at the Council of Siena, an attempt to bring the Eastern and the Western churches back together. In 1453, of course, Constantinople fell to the Turks, and hence he stayed in Western Europe. He succeeded in getting his great library out and was instrumental in the institution of the teaching of Greek astronomy from Greek texts in Italy, one of the starting points of the Greek revival in Italy. He patronized such young men as the Austrian Regiomontanus. Real name was called Johannes Müller, but he called himself Regiomontanus, from the royal mountain of Königsberg. And then gets on to probably what I would consider the first Western person to make major runs of astronomical observations since ancient times. And this is Bernhard Walther of Nuremberg, the Silicon Valley of the Middle Ages. From 1470 to 1503, Bernhard Walther, who was actually a merchant, banker by profession, and an astronomer by passion, made daily observations of the height of the sun, moon, and planets in Nuremberg, and compiled the first original tables since Ptolemy. And this, of course, was to have a major influence upon Copernicus, because his tables were later published. Now, I hope in this slightly overrun time, I've been able to give you some idea of the richness of the culture of medieval Europe. The idea, therefore, that somehow this was a blank age simply does not stand up to scrutiny. It was a time of immense discussion about science, cosmology, not to mention, by the 14th century onwards, such businesses of what is infinity, what is perfection, and things of this sort. They were even too talking about the nature of eternal punishment in cosmological terms. After all, what about hell? If you go to hell and burn, perhaps after a couple of thousand years, you're perhaps getting used to the heat. It may not be quite so bad. So therefore, does Satan need to turn the gas up a bit to make it worse? Likewise, in heaven, will you get bored? After all, when you've been in the company of the elect and sitting on clouds and singing psalms with harps for 2 or 3 million years, will you get fed up of it? No, because you'll be outside space and time. In hell, it will always be this instant now, and it will be horrible, because you'll be able to remember everything you had better in your life, and this will be worse than anything you could ever have. And in heaven, you will have no expectation of something better, because you're in the presence of God. You will obviously look at even the best joys you had in life as nothing compared to being in the presence of Christ and the elect and the apostles. Ergo, you live in one permanent, supremely joyous now in the company of God. So their theology, their physics, and their relativistic ideas all come together. And this, I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, is a very important thing when we come to understand medieval science and religion's relationship. Because they saw their faith and their science and their philosophy totally in relationship to each other. And modern ideas of there being divisions between science and faith would have been utterly meaningless to them. And very, very importantly, people did not get into trouble for thinking like this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. That's a tremendous overview. Let's have some questions. Yes, at the back.
May I just get myself some orange juice, please?
Yes.
One second, I'll be back in a second. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
As I'm slightly deaf, do you mind if I come and listen here? Thank you.
Yeah. I was wondering about the last verse in the Divine Comedy where Dante writes like l'amor qui mosse il sol e l'altre stelle, the sun and the other stars. So I was wondering whether you think Dante could have had an idea or an intimation that the sun is one of the other stars as opposed to being the sun as opposed to the stars.
Very, very good point, that's up. In medieval literature, there is an enormous pluralism of ideas about cosmology. And like I say, we have the orthodox one of the earth in the centre and things of this sort. But the idea of the sun being a star is discussed by Nicholas of Cusa, by Nicole de Arène, roughly speaking contemporary with Dante. And also, too, there were even speculations that the Milky Way, this is centuries before Galileo invents the telescope, that the Milky Way might actually be a band of stars so far away that we can't see individual ones. And there was an article published, it was in the early 80s, in the Journal for the History of Astronomy, by Michael Hoskin, Cambridge
College.
Very good friend.
Fellow of this college.
Pardon?
Fellow of this college.
Is he of this college? I thought he was fellow of Churchill. I didn't know, because I've known Michael for many years. Michael Hoskin, I think he was the author, he was certainly the editor of the journal, and it was called something like Theories of the Milky Way in Medieval Europe. And it takes up this very point, and it's looking at the nature of the medieval cosmos.
Good, thank you. Yeah, yes,
I wondered, my understanding of this is very limited, so please tell me where
Yes,
I've gone
okay.
wrong.
Yeah.
But I wondered whether for me, the idea of persecution for threatening heretical scientific beliefs doesn't come until the Catholic Church is threatened and its power base, until the Protestant
Yes.
movements
Yes.
are coming in. And so, to me, I didn't expect a lot of burning for heresy, for scientific heresy in the Middle Ages. I think that comes later at the Reformation.
It's a very, very good point. I would say, though, that the punishment you get even at the Reformation for science is actually very, very little. Galileo, I mean, the classic one is Galileo. But Galileo, of course... Pardon?
He was only threatened.
Precisely, only threatened, and only got what I would call a parking ticket class heresy. He's a personal friend of Matteo Barberini, Urban VIII. He is allowed to pick his own censor when it comes to getting his dialogue through the presses, and actually picks one whom he knows is ignorant of astronomy. It's an easy ride there. Of course, the one everybody thinks of is Giordano Bruno, born in 1600, but Giordano Bruno was himself an alpha-class theological heretic. Starts his career as a Dominican monk, abandons the Catholic faith to become a Protestant, then becomes a Greek pantheist, then starts saying that, well, effectively, there is probably no single great Godhead, the Pope is really a human figure, Christ was probably a natural man, and the fact that he happened to believe in the Copernican theory as well. The analogy I've used, it's rather like saying that the Boston Strangler went to the electric chair because he was a week late taking his library books back.
No, did you want to make a comment?
Yes.
No.
Oh, yes, did you?
Yeah, come on.
Thank you very much. What a history. It does raise one new question, though, doesn't it? I mean, given that, certainly, as you pointed out, during the so-called Dark Ages, they made great progress, for example, in optics.
Yes.
But when it comes to cosmology, looking at that pushing the barriers thing, I mean, it wasn't until 1470, I think you said, that Bernhard Volta was making his measurements.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet when Copernicus writes his work, for example, he even he goes right back to Pythagoras and his
Absolutely.
heliocentric model.
Precisely.
And the question is, why did it take, so long? I mean, Bede was talking about cosmology in 635, so what happened in those? We're still left with that.
Very, very good point, then. Basically, they think that Ptolemy holds good. They knew, of course, that there were a number of factors, such as the precession of the equinoxes. Ptolemy gives you a value for the precession which actually is wrong, but they thought was correct. And so if you therefore have an observation made by, let's say, Hipparchus in 200 odd BC, published by Ptolemy in 150 AD, with some additional observations from this Greek and that Greek, as long as they gave you the exact date, it was thought you could bring that observation bang up to date by applying all the correction factors. And so effectively, it's attempting to add new correction factors that are brought in. It's why, in this respect, we now know their astronomy got often badly wrong, their calendrical astronomy was often off, such as their date of Easter and things like that. And it's why people then, of course, like at Nuremberg, they're starting to make observations afresh. But that's what happens. They think it's possible to constantly, because after all, if these are eternal truths, an observation made in the time of Christ, if you know exactly the number of days, years, days, and minutes it was made, you go, tick, 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 you can say where it will be today. And it actually was quite good. We have the idea that they were completely wrong, but it might say that Jupiter on such and such a day in 1428 should be 3 degrees to the west of Spica. You find it's 1.5 degrees to the east of Spica. That's still not bad going. We're still talking about something that size in the sky. And so it seems to be that it's right, but it needs refining. And of course they were aware that the calendar was slipping back, because of course Greek mathematics, as they knew, was fond of round numbers. So therefore you would have a degree, whereas in fact you're dealing with about 72 odd minutes, which of course is going to be wrong. And the Greeks' fondness for round numbers, of course, is actually now being found out time and time again. And it's that factor of the corrections. They didn't think they needed to. And of course the observations they did make was for things like time and stuff like that from the astrolabe.
So the question there,
Yes?
that first, and then,
Oh,
then
sorry.
you. Yeah.
Yes, please?
Well, I fully agree with that you destroy the myth that the Dark Ages were dark. But then, where does this myth come from?
Well, that's another thing I wasn't able to take up, and it was a very great pleasure to have the question, so that allows me to take things up which I couldn't look at before. And of course, Rodney knows my pet theory on this one. I think the Reformation has something to do with it. The Protestant Reformation vilifies medieval culture in a big way. You find not only, of course, in scriptural knowledge, that you don't want the Vulgate, you want the New Greek Testament of, let's say, Erasmus, and the New Testament being brought out of Byzantium. You want to get back to exactly what you thought the apostles or Christ or the gospel writers said. Likewise, of course, you're trying to get back completely to what you think the astronomers had done. As a result, therefore, you just sort of circuit, you short-circuit 1,000 years of culture and write it off. Also, too, because in the medieval period, there'd been that accretion of religious institutions that the reformers fundamentally disapproved of. The complex ecclesiastical courts, canon law, all of these things, scrap that lot. And basically, I think they throw the baby out with the bathwater. And you find the Protestants vilifying virtually all forms of medieval achievement, unless they thought it was heretical, such as John Wycliffe's Bible, or something like that in the 14th century, the first English Bible. And Robert Hooke, on whom I published a biography, who was himself a 17th century major British scientific figure, son of a clergyman, educated in ecclesiastical institutions, Christ Church, Oxford, and so on, in one of his unpublished lectures delivered to the Royal Society, actually delivered, but never actually printed. His manuscript still survives in the Royal Society Library from 1689. And he actually speaks of the Middle Ages as those dark and monkish times. That was the time you had no science. And he says there were only two bright points in those dark and monkish times. One was Pope Sylvester, Geber de Aurillac, mathematician and millennium pope. The other was Friar Roger Bacon of Oxford. The rest of it was dark and murky and horrible. And Hooke, I think, typifies that way of thinking. And I think it's an attempt to totally sidetrack the entire medieval culture and to fail its major achievements. Yeah.
Okay, so you would look at this at 17th century?
Oh yes, well 16th century. It's when the reformers really start to get their teeth in. Okay. I mean, the Hooke one is a classic from 1689. But you don't find, well, I mean, let's say the founding of the early Royal Society. People like John Wilkins and Seth Ward, the people who are founding the new astronomy in Oxford and Cambridge and Newton, you don't see them talk about the Middle Ages. You don't talk about them mentioning Occam or Nicole del Rem or Bradwardine, no. You know, apart from that, there's some superstitious monks or something like that. They have no intellectual credibility whatsoever. And it's a short circuit in the way that the Gospels immediately jump to the 15th century. Likewise, Ptolemy immediately jumps to the 15th century.
Thank you. Yes, a question here. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. It was incredible. I've got to Google you and see how many books you've written so I can go buy them all on Amazon. But I'd like to ask you, if I may, given your, to me, what would appear to be a very consummate reflection on history and the relationship between the church, of course, and science and the tensions that are there, I'd like to ask your personal opinion on a matter. Given that with the advances in science, the church is regularly being called upon to re-examine its take on Scripture, to find,
Did you say attack on Scripture or tightening?
It's view on Scripture.
It's
you might say
view on Scripture, yes.
Right. And it would seem to me that, as I've shared with a couple of people here, my opinion, that it's kind of important that the church not be its theological positions not be as volatile as the scientific enterprise happens to be at any given moment, but that science sort of straightens itself out as time goes on.
Yeah.
What do you think a healthy and a robust relationship should be between evolving theology and the evolving scientific enterprise?
I think the church, the whole church, Catholic, Protestant, the lot, should be more proactive. It shouldn't be saying, oh dear, horrible new book by Richard Dawkins, or by horrible new book by Christopher Hitchens, or Daniel Dennett, another philosophical attack. You should get out there and put these points, the historical case, the modern philosophical case, point out, as St. Augustine does in his treatise on Genesis, that, you know, the Jews believed the world was flat, because that's what they knew in the deserts of Sinai. We now know it's round, but what really matters is God's creative power, not the cosmology. You have Origen's famous remark, which is later mouthed by Galileo: the purpose of Scripture is to teach us how to go to heaven, not to teach us how the heavens go. I mean, that's in the early church, mirrored by Baronius and then Galileo and later people later on. And I think the church, in all of its branches, needs to be more, frankly, more aggressive. And I think it needs to get out there and get its message out. And when you get somebody like Dawkins, not to say, oh dear, this horrible book, it's just, well, I have a very good colleague in Oxford, a devout Roman Catholic, a physicist, and I was talking to him a while ago about Dawkins. And he was saying to me, you know, I was saying, you know, what can we do about this? What can we do? Dawkins is so naive and he's so stupid. What can we do? Box the man's ears, for goodness sake. Not to say, oh dear, what can we do? We need to take him on and go for him. And I'd love a face-to-face with Dawkins. I've offered to do it. I've never had a response, and I'm proud to say Richard Dawkins doesn't look at me. When he passes me in the street, he...
Is that right?
And I really teased him once last summer, very briefly. I was stopping at the traffic lights in Oxford on my bike, just on red, so it's a few minutes. A friend of mine who's an astrophysicist stops at the side of me here. And then, as I'm looking over to talk to my friend Chris, Dawkins comes. He's no further away from me than you are, 3 bikes, you see. And Chris says, oh, what are you doing at the moment? And I had, that morning in St. John's College in Oxford, given a talk on science and faith. I said, oh, I've just been, deliberate, quite a, I've been giving a lecture in St. John's this morning on the compatibility of science and faith. And the lights changed and we cycled off. I went past Dawkins and overtook him. Said, good morning, Richard. And he went, you need to do more of that.
Maybe we should close the session at with that point, so before we get too many teeth into Richard Dawkins.
It's just a modern version of this.
But thank you, Alan, for absolutely brilliant talk.
Thank you.